On May 28th, 1972, 52-year-old Lily Gray was driving down a California highway in her 6-month-old Ford Pinto. In her back seat sat 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw. A few minutes later, Lily's car began sputtering and eventually stalled. At the time, Lily's car happened to be located in the center lane of this particular highway, and just a few moments later, another car rear-ended Lily's vehicle at an estimated 30 miles per hour. Immediately after the collision, the Pinto went up like a fireball. And the fire was not just on the outside, it was also present inside the vehicle. In less than a second, this fire engulfed Lily and Richard. Both did manage to escape the car, but for Lily, it was far too late, and she would soon die from her injuries. As for Richard, he would survive, but sustained third-degree burns over 90% of his body, and would have to undergo multiple skin grafts and reconstructive surgeries. 6 years later, in 1978, the Gray and Grimshaw families filed a tort action against Ford over the Pinto safety and its tendency to erupt in flames. These cases weren't the first or the last brought against Ford over the Pinto. Despite its short production run, the Pinto became, as Motor Trend put it, famous, but sadly for all the wrong reasons. In this video, we'll explore the Pinto's origins, production, competitors, and public reception. We'll also cover its design flaws, flammability, the lawsuits, and whether the car's explosive reputation may have been exaggerated. But real quick, before we get into the video, I want to ask that if you do go on to enjoy the video, that you please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Those are the two best ways to support me, and it tells me that you all enjoy what I'm doing here. But with that out of the way, let's get into the video. In the mid 1950s, small import vehicles such as the Volkswagen Beetle and the Toyota Corolla began to gain popularity in the American market. These cars were lightweight, fuel efficient, and most importantly, affordable. This was in pretty stark contrast to domestic options at the time, which usually were large, expensive, and tended to be gas guzzlers. But Ford, alongside other Detroit based automakers, didn't see the imports as a substantial threat within the American market at the time. But by the mid 60s, the imports only continued to grow in popularity, while American automakers began seeing a decline in sales. So, in the late 60s, three of Detroit's biggest automakers, Ford, GM, and AMC, began planning and designing their own subcompact vehicles to counter and sort of capitalize on the popularity of the small imports. Now, this decision didn't come easily to Ford due to infighting and drama within the company. Specifically, Simon Knudsen, the president of Ford at the time, wanted to focus on the larger, more profitable vehicles that Ford was known for, since he still didn't see the imports as a legitimate threat. However, Ford's vice president, Lee Iacocca, argued that Ford had to produce something to compete with the imports, as well as the vehicles AMC and GM were undoubtedly already working on. Knudsen and Iacocca were known to be fierce rivals in the company and would clash pretty frequently. Eventually, when it was put to a vote on what Ford's next move should be, Iacocca's idea was chosen in late 1967. But due to this infighting, Ford was already trailing behind GM and AMC, both of which were well into their developmental cycles on their own vehicles. Because of this, Iacocca introduced a very, very tight schedule for this new vehicle, which was internally dubbed Project Phoenix. In this very tight schedule, Iacocca emphasized that the Phoenix needed to be ready for the 1971 model year. Planning for the Phoenix only received approval in mid 1968, which meant there was approximately a 2-year development cycle to prepare the car for its sale in 1970. For comparison, the average developmental cycle for Detroit was anywhere between 3.5 to 4 years. On top of this already strict schedule, Iacocca had one more requirement. The Phoenix must weigh less than 2,000 pounds and cost less than $2,000, or roughly $17,000 today. Due to the constraints, the Phoenix's chassis was an almost Frankenstein esque creation built with parts from other Ford vehicles and components. Even the base engine of the Phoenix was taken from the European Ford Anglia. Now, it wasn't, and it really still isn't uncommon for automakers to use parts from other vehicles within their own respective fleets during the production of a new vehicle, so this decision really isn't that bad. It's what comes next is when this whole thing gets a little shaky, in my opinion. So, during automotive development, once a design is chosen for the vehicle, engineers begin to work on the chassis, suspension, drivetrain, and all the other things that essentially allow the vehicle to operate. Additionally, the engineers are responsible for ensuring that the vehicle can operate safely. They test things like the brakes, steering, electrical components, and the fuel systems. They are also responsible for developing prototypes of the vehicles and performing crash tests to find any flaws during collisions. Eventually, once the engineers are confident that a prototype is safe, it is then sent into the tooling phase. During the tooling phase, the car's parts are essentially locked in for mass production. Tooling basically refers to the machines, molds, and dies built to produce each component exactly as they were designed. This includes body panels like the hood, doors, bumpers, and dashboard, as well as other structural and mechanical parts. Now, once tooling is completed, major changes to these parts become very expensive and difficult, which is why the design and engineering work is largely finished before the tooling phase begins. But because of the Phoenix's strict schedule and $2,000 price target, the developmental process was rushed and the engineering and tooling phases began to overlap. This created huge problems for the engineers because once a component entered the tooling phase, it was considered locked in, meaning engineers had little ability to make changes or correct any potential safety risks that were discovered afterward. In a typical non rush development, if a safety risk is discovered during the tooling phases, engineers could recall the parts and make the necessary fixes. But this process takes both time and money, luxuries the Phoenix could not afford. So, as prototypes of the Phoenix were developed and put through crash tests, engineers became aware of a major flaw in its design. The fuel tank of the Phoenix was located at the rear of the vehicle between the rear axle and the rear bumper. However, the fuel tank sat lower than the rear axle, and during rear end collision tests, engineers discovered that the fuel tank would often be driven into the rear axle, which would puncture the tank, then causing fuel to leak. Yeah, I forgot to mention in this part of the video that when this would happen, when these rear end collisions would happen, the fires would often start either because of the sparks from the collision between the two vehicles, or by the fact that when the fuel tank was punctured, it often sprayed fuel directly onto the very hot exhaust of the vehicle. So either of those two ways is what could ignite the fires in the Pinto. It was also discovered that the rear bumper on the Phoenix was practically useless and provided no additional protection or crush space in a collision. Because of this, on top of the punctured fuel tank, the rear floor pan of the car would often crumple or separate, which would allow fuel as well as flames into the cabin of the Phoenix. Also, this crumpling would sometimes jam the doors of the car shut, making it impossible to escape. When solutions for this problem were brought forward, including things like a shield for the gas tank, Iacocca and the other higher ups that were spearheading the Phoenix project rejected them because any changes to the car would risk delaying the project and exceeding that $2,000 budget. What this tells us is that Ford while being fully aware of the fire prone state of the Phoenix, intentionally chose not to fix these issues. And while you may question how Ford could legally continue production on a vehicle with numerous safety hazards, it's worth noting that Ford was actually operating fully within the national safety standards of the time. In the late 1960s, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or the NHTSA, had only recently begun enforcing federal safety standards. At the time, there were no regulations requiring fuel systems to be protected in rear end collisions. However, in January 1969, roughly 18 months into the development of the Phoenix, the NHTSA proposed extending safety standards to include rear impact protection. Surprisingly, despite how much they knew about the Phoenix's problems, Ford did support the proposal. Even with this approval, no new standards would take effect before Ford, Chevrolet, and AMC unveiled their subcompact cars to the eager American market. AMC struck first on April Fool's Day 1970 with the release of the aptly named Gremlin. Like the Phoenix, the Gremlin was largely assembled from parts of existing AMC vehicles. Now, while Ford reused parts due to time constraints, AMC did so because it was the cheapest option. By the late 60s, AMC's resources were tied up in developing the Hornet, and rumors circulated that the company was planning to acquire Kaiser Motors' struggling Jeep division. As a result, when it came time to produce a subcompact competitor, AMC was strapped for cash and needed something quick and inexpensive. Their solution was simple. They were going to take the in development Hornet's frame and literally saw it down to subcompact size. Additionally, the engine, brakes, transmission, and suspension would also be shared from the Hornet. But with so many shared parts, AMC needed a way to differentiate this new vehicle, and they decided to do so through its styling. First sketched on an airline barf bag, and no, I'm not joking, the design of the Gremlin was a combined effort to keep costs down while also giving the vehicle its own identity and character. Given its unique looks, the Gremlin moniker was intentionally chosen by AMC since the vehicle, much like a fictional gremlin, would be loved or hated depending on who you asked. So, when the Gremlin hit the market in April 1970, its unusual appearance, its unusual appearance seemed to work in its favor, or at the very least, it didn't work against it. Now, there definitely were some buyers who were drawn to its odd looks, but mostly it was the Gremlin's practicality that won people over. As the first American contender in the subcompact battle against the imports, it was closely compared to cars like the Beetle. And to many people's surprise, the Gremlin matched and in some cases even exceeded the very qualities that made the Beetle so beloved. Firstly, the Gremlin was only a few inches longer and wider than the Beetle, but this slightly bigger size gave the Gremlin a more aggressive feeling while maintaining its low profile. This aggressive feeling was amplified by the 3.3-liter straight six engine that came standard with the Gremlin, which produced 128 horsepower compared to the measly 57 horsepower that the Beetle's flat 4 engine produced. Obviously, due to the larger engine, the Gremlin was not as fuel efficient as the Beetle, but AMC was aware of that and countered it by equipping the Gremlin with a gigantic 21-gallon gas tank, which obviously made the times between fill ups last much longer. What ultimately made the Gremlin so appealing was its affordability. In 1970, a bare bones AMC Gremlin cost $1,879, which equates to just around $16,000 today. That price placed it squarely in the same price range as the Volkswagen Beetle, which averaged around $1,839. Overall, the Gremlin was practical, powerful, and affordable. With such a strong debut, American consumers were eager to see what major automakers like Ford and Chevrolet would bring to the market. However, they'd have to wait over 5 months for the next contender, this time from Chevrolet. On September 10th, 1970, Chevrolet released the Vega. Unlike AMC's Gremlin, though, things weren't exactly sunshine and rainbows for GM's new subcompact. 2 years earlier, in October 1968, GM chairman James Roche had promised a vehicle that would weigh under a ton and cost less than the Volkswagen Beetle. This revolutionary car, codenamed XP887, was to feature an aluminum engine and be built using the most precise automated assembly process in automotive history. To outsiders, this was a positive glimpse of the future of GM, but in reality, the XP 887 was essentially destroying GM from the inside. In the early to mid 1960s, both Chevrolet and Pontiac had been developing their own subcompact vehicles. But in 1967, both divisions were blindsided when GM announced that neither of their designs would move forward. Instead, the company chose a proposal from Ed Cole, who was the executive vice president of GM's operating staff. Cole, who would later be promoted to GM president that year, had been quietly working on his own small car project, which was the XP887. Now, this whole thing, on top of them blindsiding the Pontiac and Chevy teams, there was one really, really big problem with this. Cole had only begun planning and designing the XP in early 1967. By the time GM announced it would be moving forward with Cole's idea, Chevrolet and Pontiac had already put years of work into their own projects and had even got to the point that they had developed prototypes. Now, the work of both divisions was completely scrapped by GM, and if that wasn't bad enough, GM informed Chevrolet that the project would be passed on to them to complete. Pontiac, on the other hand, suffered the worst fate and was just cut out of the subcompact program entirely because the idea was that even though the XP887 would be sold under the Chevrolet badge, the project was sort of meant to represent GM as a whole, meaning Pontiac's project wasn't necessary anymore. Now, this idea of the XP887 being essentially a poster for GM put Chevrolet in a very precarious situation. When I said that the project was passed on to Chevrolet to complete, in reality, Chevrolet had to do essentially everything. As I said earlier, Cole and his team only began planning on the XP in early 1967. So, when the project was passed along, the car only existed as an idea on paper. There weren't even any blueprints for this car. This was still the case by the time of James Roche's announcement, meaning GM was promising a car in 2 years that hadn't even left the drawing board. Soon after, however, the XP would enter development at Chevrolet. Once development began, Chevrolet found itself in another awkward position where they were doing all the work while having little authority on the car. Since the project was meant to be a flagship for GM, the company closely monitored and influenced every step. Chevrolet was responsible for developing and producing the vehicle, but had to meet strict weight and price targets along with any other requirements GM demanded. Now, as you could imagine, this caused some resentment within the Chevrolet division. So by early 1969, GM decided that the team needed a strong leader to inspire them and take charge of the project. And that leader was John DeLorean. By 1969, John DeLorean had been head of Pontiac for nearly 4 years But his history with the division went back to 1956, where he quickly became a key member of the team. He played a major role in the conception, engineering, and marketing of several of Pontiac's most iconic models, which included things like the GTO, the Firebird, and the Grand Prix. With his strong track record and strong reputation within GM, the company was confident that the XP would be in capable hands when they appointed DeLorean as Chevrolet's new general manager. Now, upon reviewing the plans for the car, DeLorean bluntly told GM it would be impossible to build it while staying within the promised price and weight limits. According to DeLorean, this issue stemmed from Cole's insistence on using an aluminum engine, which was both taller and heavier than any standard Chevy engine at the time. As a result, DeLorean warned GM that the front end of the XP would need reinforcement to handle the added weight. This concern would soon prove valid when a prototype XP887 lasted only 8 miles on GM's test track before the entire front end separated from the rest of the car. Another issue caused by the aluminum engine was the cost. At the time, aluminum engines were far more expensive to produce, combined with the need for added reinforcement, which also increased both weight and price. It became very, very clear that the XP887 would fail to meet either of its promised targets. All of these problems only exacerbated the negative feelings the Chevy crew had towards this car. But DeLorean, ever the leader, rallied his team, reminding them that regardless of how they felt about this car, the public would see it as a Chevrolet, and it was in everyone's best interest if this car succeeded. Now, DeLorean and the marketing team decided that if the car wouldn't meet its $2,000 goal, the least they could do was add a few upgrades and market it as a premium model. Also, around this time, the name Gemini was being considered as a nod to the ongoing US space program. But surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, GM rejected both the upgraded trim and the Gemini name. Instead, the XP887 would debut as an overweight, overpriced basic model under the name Vega. Now, while that name still does fit in the space theme they were going for, it performed far worse than Gemini and focus groups. Despite that, Cole insisted on using Vega, and by this point, he was definitely the president of Chevrolet. So that's what ended up being chosen. So when the Vega did finally hit the market, it debuted with a 2090 price tag and weighed in around 2,176 pounds. Despite missing both of its promised goals, public reception towards the Vega was actually pretty good. Once again, this positive reception was due in part to DeLorean's involvement, since he was also tasked with marketing the Vega. Early reviews touted the Vega's impressive styling and handling, and while the 2.3-liter inline-4 engine of the Vega was nothing extraordinary, many customers preferred the small increase in power over the Beetle. With both the Gremlin and the Vega making strong first impressions, the American market grew increasingly curious to see what Ford would bring to the table. Luckily, this time, they didn't have to wait too long. On September 11th, 1970, just one day after the Vega's debut, Ford's Project Phoenix was introduced under its new name, the Pinto. The name, taken from a horse with a distinctive coat pattern, was chosen to complement Ford's other equine themed models like the Mustang and Bronco. When we last discussed the Pinto, the NHTSA had been considering extending safety standards to cover rear end collisions, but by the time the Pinto reached the market, no such standard had been implemented. As a result, Ford released the car with an unstable fuel system and no additional protective measures. Because of this, Iacocca's goal for the vehicle to cost less than $2,000 and weigh less than 2,000 pounds was reached. When it debuted, it weighed 1,949 pounds and had a base price of $1,919. Similar to the Gremlin and the Vega, early reception of the Pinto was pretty positive. Buyers praised the price, which was more directly competitive with the Gremlin and Beetle and directly undercut the Vega. Additionally, the fuel economy of the Pinto was praised as the average miles per gallon only fell 1 or 2 points behind the Beetles, while being well above the averages of the Vega and the Gremlin. This economy was due to the use of the Kent inline 4 engine from Ford's European division. And while some complained that the Kent engine was rather lackluster, the trade off of better gas mileage seemed to appease most buyers. Overall, Ford, Chevy, and AMC all did what they set out to do, which was to challenge the wave of foreign imports. All three cars came out swinging, and the future for American compact subcompacts looked bright. But within just a few years, there were some major problems that began to arise. Now, I know that the last section sort of drifted into talking about all three cars instead of just focusing on the Pinto, but I feel it's impossible to truly understand the Pinto story without also talking about its domestic competitors. But since the main topic of this video is the Pinto, it's finally time to talk about the most infamous aspect of the vehicle, which is, of course, the fires. Production ran relatively smoothly during the first 2 years, but during that time, Ford recalled roughly 250,000 of these vehicles for two separate issues. The first involved stuck accelerators, and the second, ironically, concerned the possibility of fuel vapors trapped in the engine air filter igniting near the carburetor. It wasn't until 1972 that the NHTSA started receiving reports of fires and explosions in car crashes involving Ford Pintos. Ford, of course, was also receiving word of these fires. Ford launched an internal investigation into the problem and concluded that there was no need for any action at the time. And before you get suspicious and think, oh, well, of course they wouldn't say there's a problem with their own vehicle, the NHTSA also seconded that opinion and decided there was no action needed. A year later, in 1973, the NHTSA proposed stricter regulations regarding fuel leakage in rollover accidents. Now, Ford did object this proposal and prepared a cost benefit analysis that was titled Fatalities Associated with Crash Induced Fuel Leakage and Fires. Just keep that in mind because we're going to come back to that document here in a minute. For now, let's go back a little bit and look how the Pinto was received by the public. In its debut year of 1971, Ford produced over 350,000 Pintos, which dwarfed the numbers of both the Vega and the Gremlin, while still landing just below the Beatles' numbers. But in 1972 and 1973, the Pinto finally surpassed the Beetle, with production exceeding 480,000 units in both years. Then, in 1974, the Pinto reached its peak with 544,209 vehicles produced. That same year, the Center for Auto Safety submitted a request to the NHTSA for a recall of all Pintos to address fuel system defects. The CAS's reasoning for this request was due to reports from attorneys of a handful of deaths and injuries in rear end collisions at moderate speeds. Still, the NHTSA claimed there wasn't enough evidence to necessitate an investigation or a recall. Then, in 1975, news of explosive Pintos began reaching the public. Up until this point, reports of dangerous Pintos had mostly only reached the desks of Ford and the NHTSA. Several suits had been filed against Ford since the release of the Pinto, but most of them had been quietly settled. From the discovery of those settlements and the growing rumors of the Pinto's explosive nature, a shadow of doubt was cast over Ford. These feelings were quite reflective in the numbers of Pintos in the number of Pinto units produced in 1975, which was 223,763. This was nearly a 60% drop in sales for the vehicle, a drop from which it would never recover. In 1976, 290,132 units were produced, which was more than the previous year, but still nowhere near the 1974 figure. This rapid decline in sales signaled the beginning of the end for the Pinto. But, like I said, that drop was driven mostly by rumors and hearsay. That is, until 1977, when a court case dragged the Pinto, Ford, and their business practices squarely into the public eye. That case was Grimshaw v. Ford Motor Company, which brings us all the way back to the beginning of the video. In 1973, 1 year after the crash, the Gray estate filed a wrongful death suit against Ford. Then, in 1974, the Grimshaw family filed a personal injury suit. By that point, stories of exploding Pintos were beginning to surface, and Grimshaw's team argued that Ford was at fault because they knowingly sold a defective and dangerous car. In 1975, the two cases were consolidated and became known simply as Grimshaw v. Ford. Finally, in late 1977, the case went to trial. But in the months leading up to the trial, Grimshaw's legal team uncovered the very information Ford had been trying so hard to keep quiet. During the pretrial, Grimshaw's attorneys demanded that Ford turn over its internal documents on the Pinto, like all of the internal documents. This included things like the safety records, crash test results, fuel system reports, and most importantly, any cost benefit studies the company had done. Ford pushed back, insisting that the documents were irrelevant or protected as confidential. But eventually, the court ordered Ford to hand everything over, and once those files were released, the entire case was blown wide open. Through these documents, Grimshaw's team found mountains of evidence showing Ford clearly knew of the dangerous nature of the Pinto. The files also laid out the rushed nature of the Pinto, the discovery of the volatile fuel system, Ford's refusal to fix that fuel system, and much more. However, out of everything in those files that was discovered, the piece that stood out the most was the cost benefit analysis I mentioned earlier. Fatalities associated with crash induced fuel leakage and fires. For the sake of time, since we are going to talk about this document even more later, here's what you need to know for now. The attorneys discovered that Ford estimated it would cost approximately $137 million to implement modifications to reduce the risk of fires in their vehicles. Additionally, Ford estimated that the annual cost to cover lawsuits would be around $50 million. Therefore, according to Ford's calculations, it would be less expensive to allow people to die and then pay off their families than it would be to address a known issue with their vehicles. So, the attorneys concluded that this is exactly what Ford did. They released a rushed and potentially dangerous vehicle onto the market, and if anyone died while driving it, they would just simply compensate the family because it was cheaper than fixing the problem. Since the cost benefit document was now public evidence, the attorneys provided a copy of the memo to Mark Dowie, who was a writer for Mother Jones magazine. After receiving the memo, Dowie published an article titled Pinto Madness. This article gave the public its first real insight into the dangers of the Pinto. No longer were there just rumors, these were official documents from Ford that revealed the company's disregard for their customer safety. Dowie included the cost benefit analysis, which later became known simply as the Pinto memo, in his article, claiming that Ford was knowingly prioritizing profit over lives. He estimated that nearly 900 people had died and countless others had been injured as a result of the Pinto since its release. With the release of this article and the inclusion of the Pinto memo into evidence, the case was essentially over before it began. The trial would last about 6 months before being decided in February 1978, in which the jury awarded 128 million or 650 million today in total damages. 2.8 million or 13.5 today was granted to Grimshaw. 665,000 or 3.3 million dollars was awarded to Gray's estate, and 125 or 600 million was awarded in punitive damages. However, the judge would reduce the punitive damages to 3.5 million, but at the time, the total jury award was the largest that had ever been granted against an automaker. Following the trial, Ford was obviously reeling. Despite the reduction of punitive damages, it was far more than they had ever expected to pay. On top of that, everything they did would now be held under a microscope, and they knew it. In the aforementioned Pinto Madness article, Dowie was also quick to drag the NHTSA, which on multiple occasions did have the opportunity to investigate the Pinto and force any recalls. In response, the NHTSA, who was fearing for its own reputation, was preparing to issue a formal recall for the Pinto in the summer of 1978. However, Ford, also trying to cover themselves, voluntarily recalled over 1.5 million Pintos, as well as Mercury Bobcats, which were just rebadged Pintos. The recall was in effect for any 1971 to 1976 hatchback or sedan trim of the vehicles. In 1977, new federal regulations required that cars must withstand a rear end collision of 30 miles per hour with no fuel leakage. So from 1977 onward, new Pintos and Bobcats didn't have the volatile fuel system. Once dealerships began receiving the recalled vehicles, a shield was placed between the gas tank and the axle. The filler tube of the tank was lengthened, and the sealing of the tube was improved to reduce the chances of spraying fuel due to a collision. Added together, the parts costed less than $20 or $100 today to install. But even with these fixes, the Pinto seemed to find a way to deliver one more tragedy before finally being retired. On August 10th, 1978, Judy, Lynn, and Donna Ulrich were killed after a Chevrolet van rear ended their stationary 1973 Pinto, which caused the car to burst into flames. 1 month later, in September 1978, the Elkhart County Superior Court grand jury indicted Ford on 3 counts of reckless homicide. This was the first time in U.S. history that a corporation was charged with homicide. When the case finally went to trial in January 1980, Ford presented a much stronger defense compared to the Grimshaw case. The prosecuting attorney reiterated the argument that Ford prioritized profits over lives. In response, Ford's attorneys countered that the Pinto driven by the victims complied with all federal regulations for the year it was released. Furthermore, a member of the NHTSA who testified on behalf of Ford claimed that the Pinto was no more or less safe than other vehicles in its class. Lastly, an accident reconstruction expert testified for Ford, showing crash test footage that demonstrated when hit by the same type of Chevy van, most cars experience damage similar to that of the Pinto. Among those tested were also the Vega and the Gremlin. Following 2 months of testimony, the jury found Ford not guilty. According to the jurors, the prosecution failed to prove Ford had recklessly caused the death of the 3 girls. Also, Ford was truthful in the fact that the 1973 Pinto involved in the crash was up to standard code for the year it was produced. But even with a not guilty verdict, this was not a positive for Ford. To even be indicted for homicide obviously did not paint them in a positive light. So, due to the years of negative press and rapidly dwindling sales, Ford officially pulled the plug on the Pinto in July 1980. For its final year, 185,054 Pintos were produced, bringing the total production number for the Pinto to over 3.1 million vehicles. This was far and away better than the numbers of the Vega and Gremlin, which produced 2,000,000 and 671,000 respectively. Ford designated the Escort as the successor to the Pinto. In 1981, Ford attempted to appeal the verdict of the Grimshaw case to remove the punitive damages. Ford argued that the punitive charges were unjust since they had not purposefully or maliciously endangered their customers. Also, Ford had claimed the court made their verdict with faulty information. And when they said this, they were specifically talking about the Pinto memo, claiming it actually had no relevance to the case and was entirely misinterpreted. However, the court upheld their decision and the punitive damages would stay in effect. Now, this would essentially be the true end of the Pinto. Ford essentially just had to accept defeat and begin to try and piece their reputation back together. But in the 40 plus years since the Pinto was discontinued, there have been multiple re examinations done on the Pinto, the trials, and the Pinto memo. And through these examinations, it was revealed that Ford was somewhat correct in their arguments. Now, I'll explain why I said they were somewhat correct later, but for now, we need to take another look at the Pinto memo. Out of everything in this case, this document is the most important piece of the story. This was, in every sense of the phrase, the smoking gun in the Grimshaw v. Ford case. Not only that, but its publication in the Pinto Madness article showed the American people that Ford had decided it would be easier to let its customers die than fix the vehicle. But in reality, the Pinto memo did actually have little to do with the Pinto itself. Ford had prepared this memo in response to their objections to more stringent regulations proposed by the NHTSA regarding automotive fire safety. In the memo, Ford claimed that the cost to implement modifications to reduce fire risks would be an average of $11 per car. When you multiply that by 12.5 million vehicles, it amounts to a total of $137 million in parts. However, only 3.1 million Pintos were ever produced. So, where does that figure of 12.5 million cars come from? Well, for 1973, the year the memo was compiled, the average number of cars and light trucks sold in the US each year was about 12.5 million units. The memo was never specifically about the cost to fix the Pinto. It was about the cost to fix every light vehicle in the country. Also, this document had nothing to do with fires in rear-end collisions, the collisions the Pinto was known for. The regulations proposed by the NHTSA were regarding fires in rollover accidents. But even with knowing the document isn't Pinto specific, people still vilify Ford for putting a price tag on human lives. But there's one problem. Ford didn't put a price on people's lives. The NHTSA did. That estimated $50 million in costs for deaths and injuries in fire related accidents we talked about earlier, those calculations were done by the NHTSA. Every aspect of the Pinto memo that was used as damning evidence against Ford in reality had nothing to do with the Pinto. The whole thing just really it feels like awkward timing. Ford just so happened to compile this document in objection to a fire related regulation during the same time when the Pinto was in production. This sort of misunderstanding of the memo was a large part of the explosive mythos behind the Pinto, but it wasn't the only part. As we discussed earlier, the Pinto memo was first published in Mark Dowie's Mother Jones article, Pinto Madness. In that same article, Dowie would claim that upwards of 900 people died due to fires in Ford Pintos. This claim was supported by Ralph Nader, who is an American lawyer, politician, and activist. In 1965, Nader published a book titled Unsafe at Any Speed, which was extremely critical of the American automotive industry. In that book, Nader used fires from pending lawsuits against GM for the Corvair, which ironically would be replaced by the Vega. I won't go into too much detail about the book because that's not the point of this video. Um, all you need to know is that unsafe at any speed was crucial in the passing of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act. And then from that act, we got the NHTSA. So, long story short, Nader played a major role in the formation of federal automotive regulations. Because of this, many were quick to believe Dowie and Nader when they claimed the Pinto had killed nearly 1,000 people. The only problem is, it didn't, and they were wrong. In 1978, the NHTSA investigated fire related deaths and injuries and end collisions involving pre 1977 Pintos and Bobcats. And they concluded that a total of 27 people had died and 24 others had suffered non fatal burn injuries. Despite this, Nader, Dowie, and their colleagues would continuously claim the Pinto was a death trap, and people just believed them. Which, quick side note, Nader did nearly this exact same thing in Unsafe at Any Speed when talking about the Corvair. He made ridiculous claims about the Corvair, which were later disproven. Also, numerous people have complained about his tendency to pick and choose information to use in his works. It's almost like he's a lawyer and politician and should definitely not be trusted in any capacity. So, misunderstanding and misinformation were the main reasons behind the downfall of the Pinto. As I said earlier, in the 40 odd years since the discontinuation of the Pinto, every aspect of it has been re examined. Through that, it's been revealed that the Pinto was no more or less dangerous than any other car in its class. This idea started all the way back during the Indiana versus Ford case when the crash analyst revealed that all subcompact cars suffered similar damage in crash tests. So, why did the Pinto receive the most backlash if this was the case? Well, most likely it's just because it was the most popular of the three original subcompacts. More sold cars obviously equals a greater possibility of accidents involving said car. Also, I've yet to say this throughout the video, but I think another reason why the Pinto gets ragged on so much is just that this problem is so hilarious. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing funny about people who lost their lives due to this. But if you look past that at just a base level, a car that may just randomly explode when rear-ended is such an absurd thing that it's pretty hilarious. In fact, the only reason I even know about the Pinto, or the reason I ever really knew about it in general, is because people talk about it exploding. I was born in 2000. This thing was gone 20 years before I was even alive. So my only knowledge of this thing I had for years was basically me just going, oh yeah, that's the car that explodes. When you compare the absurdity of the Pinto's problems to the Vega and the Gremlin, it's easy to see why the Pinto was remembered. Which, shocking information, huge spoiler here, all of these cars sucked, but for vastly different reasons. Out of all of them, the Vega is arguably the worst. Early models of the Vega had wheels fall off due to faulty axles. Also, some Vegas would backfire so violently that it would explode your muffler, which would then cause hot exhaust to blow directly on the fuel tank, which obviously would sometimes lead to the fuel tank rupturing and igniting. Also, Vegas were known to be very rust prone, so much so that some dealerships reported that their Vegas they were getting new would show up with rust on them. Also, apparently, the Vegas engine would sometimes just blow up. I mean, not like like literally blow up, but it would basically just destroy itself. Now, I know I said all these cars sucked, but out of all of them, the Gremlin was probably the closest to not sucking. The only real problems the Gremlin had was that it was ugly and that it was just kind of boring. With that said, that's why I think the Pinto is remembered the most. The Vega just sucked. It was just a crappy car. The Gremlin was just kind of like meh, and the Pinto would explode. And say what you will, but that definitely gives it some character. So, since we now know the Pinto's volatility was heavily overblown, the question is now, was Ford really to blame for the deaths caused by the Pinto? And to that, I say, yeah, Absolutely. Now, given how hard I defended the Pinto and by extension Ford in the last section, it might surprise you that I still blame Ford. But when you look at a case like this, you always have to split the events into two sections. Those are what is legally allowed and what is morally correct. This is what I meant earlier when I said Ford was somewhat correct in their arguments. By legal definition, and by the standards in place at the time, Ford developed and produced the Pinto within all federal parameters. That being said, Ford was still acutely aware of the Pinto's flaws and still made the conscious decision not to fix them. Also, the fixes Ford put out during the 77 recall proved that these modifications would not have put the Pinto over its target weight and price. Nearly all of the 27 deaths directly caused by the faulty fuel system could have been avoided had Ford just spent 20 extra dollars. But hey, if there is one good thing to come out of this case, it is the implementation of more stringent safety measures and automotive manufacturers realizing that there are consequences for neglecting known issues like this. Because let me tell you something. Let me let you on a little secret here. I can guarantee you that if Ford hadn't been penalized as hard as they would have never fixed the issue in the Pinto. This also isn't exclusive to Ford. If you think for one second these massive multi-billion dollar auto companies wouldn't do the same if they were in this position, you are extremely mistaken. Even today, with our overabundance of safety features in vehicles, I can pretty much guarantee that a majority of these companies would not implement them if they weren't required to do so, all just to save themselves a few bucks. So, yeah, that's the story of the Ford Pinto. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I know it's very different from my usual topics, but I also have a pretty big interest in talking about automotive stuff. So, I thought, hey, why not try it on out here where I just yap about everything. I know I've talked about this in a few videos now, but when I started this channel, I intended to do just paranormal content, but I found that to be very limiting very quickly. So my new plan now is to just make topics on videos or make videos on topics that I find interesting, ranging from any topic. So if it's interesting, I'll probably make a video about it. Or if I find it interesting, I'll make a video about it, regardless of whatever niche the topic may fill. Like always, I want to thank you all for your continued support and patience. In the last video, I sort of talked about where I've been and what's been happening in the months since I've been gone, so I won't go into too much detail again. All you need to know really is that I'm taking a more laid back approach to my content and channel. This is still a huge passion of mine, but I have a tendency to stress and burn myself out while pursuing my passions. Basically, I like to I mentally turn my passions into like a job, which in turn ruins it. And obviously, I don't want to do that on this channel. Um, Especially given the size of my channel, I definitely can't look at it with that approach. I started making all of these videos to have fun and talk about the weird things I'm interested in. But over time, despite being relatively new to this whole YouTube thing, I would set ridiculous goals and deadlines for myself that are usually impossible to reach. Then, when I fail to reach those ridiculous goals, it sort of killed any fun I had. And I always felt like I squandered any sort of momentum I had going on the channel. I know it's all a mental thing, but I have started trying to take steps to avoid getting in this space. I've tried to stop making up these sort of imaginary deadlines and just focus on right here, right now. Focus on that and nothing else. Now, of course, some days are better than others, but so far this has helped a lot. If you want to take something for example, take this video for example. I started working on the outline for this video back right before I took that huge break in the summer. And when I started it, I felt I had like good momentum going on the channel and had to keep that ball rolling. However, this summer was really, really chaotic in my life. I just had a lot of stuff going on. So because I was busy, weeks turned into months uh, of me not working on this. So I made no progress on anything. Everything sort of came to a halt regarding my content. And the longer it went without me making anything or working on anything, the more I got in my head. And then of course the more I got in my head, the more angry and upset I became. And this is kind of just what I mean when I say like I sometimes kill the fun that I have making these videos. However, in December, out of nowhere, I got that same feeling of creativity and fun I had when I first began the channel. I recorded the Cecil Hotel video and finished the outline for this one. And I did it without setting any sort of ridiculous time frames for myself or any sort of unreachable goals for myself. I just worked on what I could work on when I could work on it, and I enjoyed it. Now, obviously, I don't want to take super long breaks like I did over the summer, but what I learned is that sometimes I do need to give myself some sort of break. This whole cryptic thing, this whole YouTube thing that I'm doing is I did it because it's my passion, and I never wanted it to be something that I hated. So from now on, that's how I'm going to look at it. I'm going to do my best to just do what I can when I can. With that being said, I want to thank you all once again for watching the video, and thank you if you made it through all that yapping I just did. If you did enjoy the video, all I ask is that you consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on the video, as those are the best ways to support me. And tell me that you all enjoy what I'm doing here. Also, new microphone. Tell me how it sounds down in the comments. But yeah, as always, I hope to see you all again very, very soon.